Good morning, my friends. I'm so glad you could be with me today as we have another time in God's Word in our Unfolding the Word series. We're in the midst of Daniel, beginning to see what was going on in the opening chapters of Daniel. I'm going to pick up our reading today in verse 5 and work through verse 9 together. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. And they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank, and therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Well, quickly, if you've been with me for these days, you're following the story. Daniel has been taken off as a captive to Babylon. He's in his young teenage years. All of this was tied to God's discipline upon the people of Judah as they had rebelled against him and refused to listen to the prophets. Daniel is now captive, exiled from his land in Babylon, and he's facing a 3-year training program, a comprehensive program geared to indoctrinating him. The goal was to transform his worldviews, to use language studies, philosophy, religious studies, magi activity, economics, politics, etc., to turn him into a Babylonian in terms of worldview instead of a Jew. We talked more about some of those different parts of that training program yesterday. So the question before us today is, at what point did the forced training and indoctrination program compromise his faith? We saw yesterday that the line wasn't drawn over the secular education curriculum, interestingly enough. We also saw that the line was not drawn over the forced preparation to serve the king, the hated king, the one who had defeated his country and killed many of his countrymen. Well, if he didn't draw the line there, if Daniel did not see those activities as inherently compromising of his faith, where did he draw the line? And really, that's what we want to talk about today, knowing when and where to draw the line. So where did Daniel draw this line? Well, the verses I read to you, it was clear. He drew the line at the issue of the food and drink. The key is that it was at this point, not the secularized curriculum, not the indoctrination, not even the exposure to the magi ideas. It was at the point of the food that a collision occurred between the king's edicts and conscience on the part of Daniel. Here is where the king's commands conflicted with God's commands. Now, why was this so? And why was this issue so much more important to Daniel and his friends, by the way, than the secular curriculum or the preparation to serve the hated government? And of course, the answer is because conflicting with God's word is vastly more important than any other issues. The Old Testament law defined what was proper for a Jew to eat. Leviticus 11, you can take some time on your own, we won't today, but Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy 14, and other passages develop the dietary restrictions that were on the Jews, restrictions that were put in place to mark them out as God's people. Not because these dietary restrictions were, quote, healthier, but they were definitive. They were those things that set God's people apart from other people. And so Daniel and his 3 friends decided we cannot defile ourselves with the food and the drink the king is offering us. We instead must live in accordance with God's law. We've seen nothing that conflicted with God's law in the forced indoctrination program, But we do see it here at the point of the food. And they were willing to risk their lives over this issue. Because to say, I will not eat the food, puts you on a collision course with the authority. Much like Peter later on in Acts chapters 4 and 5 in the New Testament, where the authorities were commanding him not to proclaim, and the other apostles not to proclaim, Jesus Christ. And his response is, we must obey God rather than man. In other words, you can command us other things, we'll follow it, but we cannot follow you there, because God has called for us to put him first. Well, how did this work out in this circumstance with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Well, there were a number of steps that he went through after drawing this line. And we'll look at them today. We'll finish looking at them tomorrow. Let's look at the first step in this crisis resolution issue. How this drawing of the line led to steps that were necessary in order to seek to resolve the conflict and collision that arose between drawing the line and the commands that were on them. The first step in this, I think we see in verse 9, where it says, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. The first step is that God calls for us to trust that he will be working in other people, that he will be working in the hearts of other people, that as we put God's word ahead of everything else, that God will be doing those things in the hearts of authorities to give them favorable orientation toward us. Now, that's not the same thing as saying God works in another person's heart to force them to believe. That's not what we're talking about. The scriptures tell us that the heart of a king is like water in the hands of the Lord. So the point is, in the positions people are in, God will be at work in the decisions they make in those positions. God was working in the one given authority over Daniel and the others to implement the 3-year training program and the food and drink allotments. God calls for us to trust him to be working in those people who are over us, the key players in our life circumstance. In this case, we learned back in verse 3 of the first chapter that the name of this chief eunuch, this chief administrator, was Ashpenaz. God was taking Ashpenaz and working in his heart, giving him a favorable view of Daniel and his friends. Now understand, this favorable view was emerging before time had gone by for Daniel and his friends to prove their behaviors to him. I mean, this was right at the beginning of this process. And yet God, at work in this man, this Ashpenaz, gave that man an attitude of confidence, favor, and compassion, which is the way it's described in verse 9, toward Daniel. And therefore, by doing that, made him more open to consideration of other things that Daniel would say and do to try to resolve this issue. How does that apply to you and I? Well, we are called upon to trust that God will work in the Ashpenazes of our lives. Because all of us, because we live in this world, are under authority of different forms. At work, in the home, in the culture, in the government. And God says, I want you to trust those Ashpenazes, those chief eunuchs, these authorities into my hands. And trust that in ways you can't understand, I will be at work in them. As you choose to be faithful to me and respectful of them, I will work in them. And at times, my work in them will give them favor and compassion upon you in the circumstance that you're in. I guess the summary of that is God is saying, understand, as you're choosing to be obedient to me, you are not alone in this world. I'm with you, and I will be working. Now, does God always resolve it? No, sometimes we see in the scriptures, as Hebrews 11 ends with reminding us, that as we choose to be faithful to the Lord, those circumstances lead us into persecution and even death at times. God has purposes we don't always understand. But nonetheless, he is calling for us to trust, as Daniel did, that he can work in the hearts of people we seemingly can't work in. Are you committing the Ashpenazes of your life into God's hands? Step one in the resolution of the collision between following the Lord and the pressures that are on you in the culture you're in is to trust the Ashpenazes of your life into God's hands. Join me tomorrow as we continue to see the other steps that Daniel and his friends took in seeking to resolve this impasse in this issue of food and drink in the enforced training program in Babylon. God bless.